Adoption has really defined my life in every way. I was adopted as an infant in 1960. I was the kind of kid that thought about it a lot and asked a lot of questions. My parents were really supportive of talking about it, but they had no background information. They were given an index card when they adopted me that said what formula I drank and what schedule, and no other information at all. When I was a kid, women would stop my mom and I on the street when we were shopping, and I had flaming red hair. So they would ask, "Oh, where'd she get her red hair?" And I would just honestly say, "I'm adopted. We don't know." They would recoil, and I could tell that there was something shameful. If my mom were to answer first, she would just say, "Oh, there was sandy hair in the family," and smooth it over. So I quickly learned that there was a lot more to this than the positive messaging that I was getting at home, and that it was more complex. Although my parents were really open with me that she would deny my reality out in public that way was shocking. I always wanted to know more about my background. I had no access to any medical history. I remember back at that time, I literally wondered if my birth mother remembered that she had me, because you never heard stories of birth parents. And I knew other adoptees, but I never ever heard a story about somebody being a birth parent. And it was an eerie silence. I had nothing to gauge how she might have felt or what this might have been like for her. All of my fantasies of searching and finding out more, I squashed down because I thought it was impossible. And until I was in a bookstore in maybe 1985, and a book almost leapt off the shelf at me called The Adoption Triangle. I bought it and stayed up all night reading it. It really blew my mind to read stories of birth parents and adoptees and reunions, and really take a look at how secrecy entered adoption. I really came to realize that this might be healing not only for me, but might be really healing for her as well. And so I committed myself to finding her. And this was the 80s, so I couldn't just go Google something. I wrote to Alma and paid my $45. They didn't write back. So it was just kind of like, okay, another dead end. I did contact the agency that I was adopted through for background information. And a few months later, they called me and said, "Oh, we've got your background information." And I asked if I could come down and meet with them. And they made that sound like that was a very unusual request. But I really insisted, and I went and met with the social worker, who I think didn't know what to do with me. They gave me one page of typed information, and it said that my birth mother had blonde hair and that my birth father had blonde hair. And I knew enough about genetics to know you don't get a red haired person out of two recessive gene blonde people. And so something was off, but they've got my record and I don't. And so who am I to question what they say? So I started my search. My search took me a year. I tried a lot of different things. And Alma finally wrote me back. They said that my birth certificate should be open to me in Ohio, given the year that I was born, which was news to me. The person at the agency hadn't said anything about that. The person at the agency had asked me if I was interested in searching, and the things that I had read basically said, don't tell them that you're interested in searching because they might give you less information. So I said, no, but I'd be really open to it. He offered that if they heard from her, they would connect the two of us. Was kind of spinning my wheels with this one page of background. It said that she was 16. Then I sent away for my original birth certificate, and the state was very efficient. Within 2 weeks, it was December 14th, 1985, at about noon. This was a life-changing moment. I got the envelope and opened my original birth certificate. The first name I saw on the birth certificate was Victoria Faith Boyer. And I thought, wow, she had a really beautiful name. And then as I looked closer, that's what she had named me. And this was 40 years ago, and it still brings tears. Her name was below on the birth certificate. My birth father's name was not listed. Her address at the time of my birth was outside of Philadelphia, but it also had the address of the Florence Crittenden home in Cleveland, where she was living during the pregnancy. The Florence Crittenden home was no longer in operation, but the building that they had been in was still there, and it was across the street from my workplace. I could see it out the window. embarked full force on a search. Still, even from that point in time, took 5 more months because I really didn't know what I was doing. But I had her name, which is huge. I went to Philadelphia a couple times and did a bunch of research. Finally called someone who was in her graduating class and just said that I was putting together a family reunion and she was a relative I'd lost contact with, just not untrue. He gave me information that led me directly to her. So I chose to call her work. She actually answered the phone as much as I'd prepared. I was so unprepared. I said, I've got something very private and personal to talk to you about. Is this a good time? She gave me the green light. So I led into, as gently as I could think of, telling her who I was. And before I even got through my spiel, she said, "Oh my God, I've been praying for this call for 26 years." And we both burst into tears. I remember having an extreme adrenaline rush and just so much relief and excitement. It had been like jumping off a cliff, not knowing if there was a net to even get myself to say the words on the phone that I'd rehearsed. At some point, she said, "Well, Bob is going to be so happy." And she explained to me that she had married my birth father a year and a half after I was relinquished, and that they went on to have 3 kids. When I was preparing for my call with my birth mother, I tried to prepare myself for all the different outcomes or things that she might say. She denies that this is what I'm going to do. If she is silent, this is what I'm going to do. And I really had not prepared myself for unconditional acceptance. I was speechless to hear those words. As much as I thought I had prepared, I'd never thought about how to start a conversation or what else to ask, or it all hinged on that answer, what she was going to say when she realized who I was. And luckily, she was very poised and she started right in filling in the gaps for me. As much as I was worried about shocking her, I think I was the one that had to be scraped off the floor. It was so much more than I had anticipated. That phone call was in May of 1986, so in 5 months it'll be 40 years. I was very fortunate. My adoptive family was very open. They agreed to meet. The ironies of life here, my birth parents are married all this time. My adoptive parents had gotten divorced when I was a kid. Watching my birth mother and my adoptive mother meet was probably one of the most profound experiences in my reunion. When they hugged and shed tears and thanked each other for the piece of me that they'd each had that the other one would have loved to have been there for, it made me whole in a way that I didn't even know was missing. I'm deeply cemented in both families. My birth family is also my family, but you can't make up for that lost time. So my birth parents never became mom and dad, but they're as close to me as they could be. My son, who's now 28, grew up knowing my birth parents as grandparents. I channeled my feelings into activism. I came to realize adoptees have 2 birth certificates. I had this birth certificate that showed my identity when I was born, and then that becomes amended to reflect the adoptive parents, basically as having given birth to me. Unless you really know what you're looking for, there's virtually no difference between the original and the amended. So if someone did not know that they were adopted, they would not know that by looking at their amended birth certificate. I was able to get my original birth certificate because of the year I was born, but adoptees just a couple years younger than me weren't able to get that document. The records had been closed in 1964. And that just struck me as a social justice issue, that people couldn't get that basic information about themselves and how valuable that was for me. Not just in terms of having the information to search, but just how grounding and deep that went for me. It really struck me how unfair it was that adoptees couldn't have this basic document about themselves. In America, we're used to being able to access what the government has that pertains to us. And it was so profoundly important to be able to get that other document that I don't think I really realized existed. I'd never really been an activist on an issues before, but it was so compelling that I jumped right in to try to get that changed. It was just the beginning of a movement to create access to birth records. I started Adoption Network Cleveland for people to come and get support and learn and grow and heal through peer support and having opportunities to tell their stories. I didn't mean to change careers when I started the organization. It took over my life in so many different ways. I've now been working for the organization as the director for 30 years. So it's been my life's work. Our first bill to try to get the records open was in the late 1980s, and we finally got it passed in 2013 and implemented in 2015. So it was really a 25-year endeavor. And through the process of trying to change the law, it was a hefty dose of how misunderstood adoptees and birth parents were and are still in many ways. I will never forget the opposition and the things that legislators and judges and advocates from conservative organizations that didn't want the records open come and say. There was a judge who came and testified that he was a probate court judge, so he finalized adoptions. And he came and testified that the only birth parents he ever heard from after an adoption were ones that were in prison and wanted somebody to send them cookies or a place to go when they got out. There was Bill Pierce from the National Council for Adoption came and was waving around his credit card and said, if you open these records, next thing you know, your credit history will be open to the public. We were not asking for them to be open to the public. The Ohio Right to Life was our consistent big opposition for 20 years, and we started calling the Ohio Right to Lie Association. At every hearing, the opposition would orchestrate one adoptee and one birth parent and one adoptive parent to speak against the bill. I know there's a big debate about whether the adoption should exist or be allowed at all. I sadly think that there will probably always be kids that do need some type of resource beyond their birth family. More and more kids are being placed in kinship care, which is wonderful. But to me, as problematic as adoption is, I also think that permanency for kids is really important. And so, in limited cases where it's needed, I do think that kids deserve to grow up in a secure family situation. And there's some kids that won't have that otherwise. I think there should be truth and openness and as much communication as possible.